In a world that moves faster than our own thoughts, where every screen quietly whispers who we should be and what we should want, people begin to resemble reflections rather than individuals repeating the same dreams, chasing the same versions of success, and shaping their lives around images they never chose. And if you've ever felt that strange discomfort, that sense that your desires don't fully belong to you, then this video is your reminder to pause, to breathe, and to finally see the invisible forces that shape the modern mind. So if you want more content that digs beneath the surface and speaks to the parts of you the internet usually ignores, make sure to subscribe, because we're about to explore the truth behind why we're all becoming the same without even realizing it. People often believe that their desires are personal, intimate, and rooted somewhere deep within their own consciousness. But in reality, most modern desires have been gently shaped, polished, and synchronized by a system that repeats the same images, the same lifestyles, the same ambitions, and the same ideal versions of happiness, until people begin to mistake this repetition for something they genuinely want. And the strangest part is how effortlessly this transformation happens, how seamlessly external pressure becomes internal motivation, how quickly a borrowed dream begins to feel like your own, even though it never truly belonged to you. There was a time when desires grew out of experience, out of a person's upbringing, their struggles, their surroundings, their culture, their temperament. But in today's world, desires are manufactured through exposure, meaning that the more often you see something, the more naturally your mind begins to accept it as the standard. And the moment it becomes a standard, it becomes a silent command. You scroll for a minute, then another minute, then an hour, and with every image, with every flawless face, with every minimalistic room, with every rigidly defined version of success, your brain absorbs a carefully engineered message about what you should want, what you should look like, and what your life should resemble. And even though you never consciously agreed to any of it, you still begin to feel strangely obligated to chase it, because not chasing it makes you feel like you're falling behind everyone else. The modern world has turned desire into a product, and the most efficient way to mass-produce desire is to eliminate uniqueness, to replace personal aspirations with collective templates, to give everyone the same dream, so that everyone becomes predictable, manageable, and easily guided toward the same goals, the same purchases, the same behaviors. This is why people across completely different countries, cultures, and backgrounds suddenly want the same body type, the same clothing, the same vacations, the same interior style, the same relationship dynamics, the same lifestyle philosophies, not because billions of people have simultaneously evolved toward the same preference, but because they have been quietly synchronized by a digital environment that thrives on uniformity. Desire today spreads not through personal discovery but through repetition. And repetition is the most powerful psychological force in existence, because when something is shown to you 1,000 times, your mind can no longer distinguish between "I like this" and "I am used to seeing this." And the moment familiarity replaces authenticity, individuality begins to dissolve. This dissolution doesn't feel dramatic or painful. It feels soft, natural, convenient, because conforming to a trend is always easier than resisting it. And imitating the majority always requires less energy than questioning the majority. Which is why most people don't even notice when their desires stop belonging to them. They simply live inside a comfortable flow of borrowed aspirations that were planted around them long before they ever had the chance to define their own. What makes this even more dangerous is how pleasant the process feels. The system doesn't force you, it seduces you. It doesn't command you, it comforts you. It doesn't confront your will, it quietly surrounds it until your will aligns with its suggestions. And because it all happens gradually, you never realize the moment when the quiet machinery of influence begins speaking louder than your own inner voice. Modern desire is no longer a reflection of the self. It is the outcome of constant exposure, engineered familiarity, algorithmic repetition, and cultural pressure, all woven together so seamlessly that the final result feels like an authentic dream, even when it is nothing more than a template you are expected to follow. And the tragic irony is that the more people adopt these standardized desires, the more they begin to look, speak, behave, and dream alike, creating a society full of individuals who believe they are unique, while unknowingly chasing the exact same goals as everyone else. This is the foundation of the copy-paste personality. Not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of creativity, but a lack of space, mental, emotional, and social space, to discover, who a person truly is, beneath the noise of collective expectation. Every repeated image steals a little bit of your originality. Every trending lifestyle steals a little bit of your imagination. Every borrowed dream steals a little bit of your voice. Until one day you wake up and realize that you are living a life that resembles millions of others. A life optimized for external approval rather than internal meaning. A life shaped not by who you are, but by what the system has taught you to desire. There is a quiet moment, usually somewhere between boredom and habit, when you open your phone without any particular intention, and before your mind even awakens to what it's doing, the algorithm has already decided what you will see, what you will feel, and what you will think about next, creating the illusion that you are casually browsing when in reality you are being carefully guided along a path designed to keep you watching, reacting, absorbing, and reshaping yourself in ways you barely notice. Most people imagine algorithms as neutral tools, as harmless technical systems that simply reflect their preferences back at them, but the truth is far more hypocrite, because algorithms do not merely mirror your behavior, they mold it, studying you with a precision no human observer could match, extracting patterns from your pauses, your hesitations, your curiosities, your insecurities, your impulses, and then using those patterns to gently steer your attention in directions that benefit the system more than they benefit you. This process is not aggressive. In fact, it is so seamless that it feels like comfort, like personalization, like the digital world understands you better than you understand yourself, which is exactly how the algorithm maintains its influence, by making guidance feel like freedom and manipulation feel like convenience. Every second you spend scrolling becomes data. Data about what captures your eyes for half a second longer. Data about what irritates you enough to keep you engaged. Data about what soothes you, about what makes you jealous, about what gives you a dopamine spike, about what makes you stay just a little bit longer. And with every new piece of data, the algorithm refines its understanding of you, or rather, its understanding of the version of you that is most predictable, most reactive, and most easily captivated. The algorithm is not reading your mind, it is training it. It takes your raw impulses, polishes them, amplifies them, and feeds them back to you until they become habits. And once they become habits, they become desirous. And once they become desirous, they become part of your identity, which means that in the span of a few months, the digital architecture around you may influence your personality more than your upbringing, your education, or your environment ever did. Consider the subtlety of this transformation. You might think you're exploring your interests, but the algorithm is narrowing them. You might think you're forming opinions, but the algorithm is reinforcing the same ones. You might think you're choosing content, but the content has already chosen you. The system does not ask who you are, it decides who you will become based on what keeps you engaged the longest. It nudges you toward echo chambers because they are comforting. It nudges you toward trends because they are contagious. It nudges you toward certain emotions because they are profitable. It nudges you toward certain aesthetics because they are replicable. It nudges you towards certain beliefs because they anchor you to specific communities, and communities mean retention. And the most dangerous part is that the algorithm rarely introduces something that challenges you. It introduces things that maintain you, stabilize you, freeze you in a predictable pattern where you keep returning not because you want to grow, but because the system wants you to remain manageable. Over time, your inner landscape begins to resemble your feed. Fragmented, repetitive, reaction-driven. Optimized for stimulation rather than reflection, filled with familiar images that feel comforting but slowly drain your ability to form desires that originate from within. A human mind that consumes too much algorithmic content stops being exploratory and becomes reactive. It stops asking, what do I truly want? And begins asking, what do I want next that will give me the same quick hit of satisfaction the algorithm has taught me to crave. In this state, free will becomes a softened concept, a word we continue to use because it feels important, even though our decisions increasingly behave like responses to invisible suggestions rather than creations of our own thought. What makes this dynamic so frightening is how gentle it is. The algorithm doesn't punish you for straying. It guides you back with content you find pleasurable, comforting, validating, and familiar, until you gradually prefer the algorithm's voice to your own inner voice. Because the algorithm never doubts, never hesitates, never questions, while your inner voice often feels uncertain, unfamiliar, or subdued after years of being overshadowed. And once you start preferring the algorithm's certainty to your own uncertainty, the system has achieved what older forms of control never could. It has created a psychological environment where obedience feels like autonomy and imitation feels like insight. Many people believe that algorithms show them what they already like, but in reality, algorithms show them what will keep them predictable, and predictability is far more important to the system than authenticity ever will be. When the algorithm realizes that you react strongly to a certain type of idea, it feeds you that idea repeatedly until it becomes part of your worldview. When it notices that you respond emotionally to a particular aesthetic, it floods your feed with it, until your taste subtly shifts in its direction. When it sees that something makes you insecure, it reinforces that insecurity enough to keep you engaged, but not enough to make you leave. You are not consuming content, you are being conditioned by it. And as conditioning deepens, individuality thins. People begin to imitate the same phrasing, adopt the same humor, use the same rhetorical patterns, express the same political beliefs, pursue the same lifestyle goals, feel the same anxieties, idolize the same personalities, and fear the same things, not because they arrived at these perspectives independently, but because algorithms pull millions of people along identical psychological pathways that feel like self-expression, even when they are not. This is why human diversity online often feels superficial. Different colors, different aesthetics, different cultures, but beneath the surface, the same emotional logic repeats everywhere, producing a global population that thinks it is thinking for itself, while unknowingly functioning as an extension of the system it interacts with. As a result, the modern human being faces a strange paradox. They have access to infinite information, but gradually lose the capacity for independent interpretation. They have unlimited freedom of expression, but unconsciously restrict themselves to the patterns that the algorithm rewards. They believe they are choosing their influences, but their influences are choosing them. And when the architecture of desire is shaped by a machine that prioritizes engagement over truth, stability, or self-awareness, the line between who you are and what you've been trained to prefer becomes almost impossible to distinguish. Eventually, you begin to wonder, quietly, uncomfortably, privately, whether the things you love are truly yours, or whether they are simply the easiest things for the system to feed you. That question, once it enters your mind, is the first sign of awakening, the first moment when you recognize that your inner world may have been constructed in collaboration with forces you never consciously invited inside. But awakening is rare, not because people lack intelligence, but because the environment makes sleep feel so comfortable. There is something almost hypnotic about the way trends sweep across the modern world, not as harmless moments of shared taste, but as powerful currents that pull millions of people into the same aesthetic, the same language, the same posture toward life. As if the collective imagination has been condensed into a single repeating image that everyone is expected to reproduce in their own lives. And what makes this phenomenon particularly striking is the quiet fear that lurks beneath it, the fear of appearing out of sync, the fear of looking strange, the fear of being the person who doesn't fit neatly into whatever the culture has decided is right this month. In earlier generations, trends moved slowly, often taking years to settle into the fabric of society, and even then they left enough gaps for individuality to slip through. But today, trends evolve and spread with such speed and intensity that by the time a person has formed an opinion about one aesthetic, another has already taken its place, leaving people constantly adjusting their identity in micro-movements, like dancers trying to keep up with a rhythm that never stays still long enough for them to catch their breath. The result is a culture where belonging feels impossible without participation, where standing out feels like a risk, and where silence, authenticity, or personal taste can feel like social liabilities rather than expressions of individuality. People follow trends not because trends speak to their deepest truth, but because trends offer a kind of safety, an invisible shield of similarity that protects them from judgment, rejection, or ridicule. It's not the trend itself that people crave, it's the protection it provides. When you blend in, you cannot be mocked for being different. When you mimic the majority, you cannot be blamed for making the wrong choice. When you follow the script, no one expects you to write your own. And so people cling to trends as if they were life rafts in a turbulent ocean of visibility. hoping that synchronization will spare them from the discomfort of being seen too clearly. This fear is heightened by the modern condition of constant observation. Everyone is always looking, always judging, always interpreting. And even when people insist that they don't care what others think, the psychological structure of the online world makes complete indifference nearly impossible. Every action, every outfit, every idea, every mistake is preserved, shared, repurposed, dissected, sometimes mocked, sometimes adored, sometimes weaponized, and under that kind of scrutiny, even the most confident person begins to calculate their choices with the public eye in mind. Trends offer a shortcut, a way to present oneself in the correct format, reducing the chances of misunderstanding or criticism. They become a kind of social camouflage, a way to be visible without being vulnerable. But the cost of this camouflage is the gradual erosion of originality, because when a person repeatedly chooses what is socially rewarded instead of what is personally meaningful, they train themselves to prioritize external validation over internal alignment, until the concept of self becomes blurry, fragile, and dependent on the reaction of others. This dynamic creates a strange and painful tension inside many people, the longing to express something unique, clashing with the fear of standing alone, the desire to be seen clashing with the fear of being judged, the hunger for authenticity clashing with the pressure to conform, and beneath it all, the quiet recognition that the more you shape yourself to fit the trend, the more invisible your true self becomes. What's especially interesting is how trends pretend to celebrate individuality while actually enforcing uniformity. Every trend comes packaged with language like self-expression, authentic living, or find your style. But the moment millions of people adopt the same version of self-expression, uniqueness disappears, replaced by a mass-produced identity that feels personal only because everyone else is wearing it too. It's like being given 20 different flavors of the same thing and being told it's choice. The variety is superficial, the structure is identical, and in this structure, trends become a substitute for identity, a ready-made template that people can step into without having to ask the difficult questions. Who am I without external approval? What do I desire when no one is watching? What do I believe when the crowd goes silent? What beauty do I see in the world when I stop searching for what's popular? Most people never get the chance to answer these questions because the speed of modern culture never leaves enough quiet time to explore them. Instead, people drift from trend to trend, like passengers on a train who don't know the destination but are too afraid to get off, fearing that stepping away from the crowd means stepping into irrelevance. But irrelevant to whom? That is the deeper question trends never allow you to ask, because the moment you stop chasing relevance, the entire structure of trend culture collapses. It survives only because people believe that being unseen is a form of failure, that being overlooked is a kind of death, that being different means being alone. And loneliness is one of the few emotions people fear more than meaninglessness. This fear becomes the engine of conformity, pushing people towards sameness in the hope that sameness will protect them from the discomfort of isolation. Yet the great paradox is that conformity does not eliminate loneliness, it intensifies it. If you reshape yourself to match the expectations of others, you may gain acceptance, but you lose the ability to be understood. People like you, but they don't know you. They recognize you, but they don't see you. They talk to you, but they never reach the real you, because the real you has been pushed deeper and deeper under the polished surface of trend-driven identity. And so a strange emptiness begins to grow beneath the synchronized aesthetics. An emptiness that whispers, "This doesn't feel like me. This doesn't feel real. This feels like I'm wearing someone else's life." But instead of stepping away from the trend, most people double down, hoping that if they perfect the aesthetic or align themselves more precisely with the cultural moment, the emptiness will dissolve. It never does, because the emptiness isn't caused by imperfection, it's caused by inauthenticity. Being part of a trend can be fun, but relying on a trend to define who you are is a slow erosion of selfhood. And in a world where everyone is terrified of standing out, the few who dare to stand alone become the only ones who truly feel alive. There is a subtle but devastating shift taking place in the modern mind, a shift so gradual that most people never recognize it until they try, truly try, to sit alone with a thought for more than a minute, only to discover that their attention slips away like water through their fingers, revealing a truth few want to admit. We are no longer thinking, we are reacting, and our lives are increasingly shaped not by reflection or intention, but by impulses triggered by an endless stream of stimuli designed to keep our minds in a state of perpetual fragmentation. Deep thinking, the kind that requires stillness, patience, discomfort, and the willingness to confront our own contradictions, has become almost impossible in a world where every empty second is instantly filled with content. Notifications, recommendations, trending clips, outrage, entertainment, or distraction, each fragment pulling the mind toward a new direction before any previous idea has time to settle or take root. The mind, which once stretched itself through long periods of concentration, now jumps frantically from one microstimulus to another, like a bird skimming the surface of a lake without ever diving beneath. And as this pattern becomes habitual, the ability to think deeply begins to atrophy, leaving people with the unsettling feeling that something inside them has grown weaker, even if they cannot explain what exactly has been lost. The constant flow of short reactive content trains the brain to process the world in shallow bursts, rewarding speed over depth, immediacy over understanding, emotional intensity over nuance, and repetition over originality, until the very idea of sustained thought feels exhausting, outdated, or unnecessary. This collapse of deep thinking does not happen suddenly. It happens through thousands of small, almost invisible choices. The decision to check your phone the moment silence appears, the impulse to fill boredom with stimulation, the habit of skimming instead of reading, the reliance on summaries instead of exploration, the preference for quick opinions instead of considered judgment. And each of these choices seems harmless in isolation, but together they reshape the cognitive architecture of the human mind. People often say they are too busy to think, but the truth is more difficult. They are too overstimulated. Their minds are constantly occupied, but rarely engaged, filled, but rarely nourished, active, but rarely alive. What passes for thinking in the modern world is often just a chain of emotional reactions to whatever the algorithm decides to place in front of us next. A cycle of anger, amusement, envy, outrage, distraction, approval, and discomfort that repeats endlessly without ever forming a coherent inner narrative. And because our thoughts now mirror the structure of our feeds, fragmented, rapid, emotionally charged, many people start to experience a kind of internal instability, a difficulty in grounding themselves, a sense that their mind is crowded with noise but empty of clarity. This instability creates a psychological vulnerability. When a person cannot think deeply, they cannot form their own beliefs. When they cannot form their own beliefs, they cannot resist external influence. When they cannot resist external influence, they become easy to guide. Not through force, but through a constant stream of suggestions that feel natural simply because they are familiar. The collapse of deep thinking is not just an intellectual crisis. It is an identity crisis. Without the ability to question, evaluate, reflect, or understand, people begin to adopt thoughts the same way they adopt trends, quickly, unconsciously, and without examining whether those thoughts align with their values or even make sense. This is why so many people today hold contradictory opinions without realizing it, shifting their beliefs according to what feels right in the moment. Because their worldview is not constructed through introspection, but assembled from fragments of content that elicited strong emotional reactions. And strong emotion creates the illusion of conviction, even when the underlying idea is shallow or inconsistent. In this environment, long-term goals become harder to define, personal values become harder to articulate, and people suffer from a low-grade mental exhaustion that comes from constantly processing information without ever transforming it into meaning. The mind was not built to juggle 1,000 small pieces of incomplete information every day. It was built to explore a few meaningful ideas deeply, to sit with them, to struggle with them, to understand them. But the modern world has inverted that structure, giving us infinite breadth and almost no depth. As a result, people begin to feel a strange internal emptiness, a sense that their thoughts are not really theirs, that their focus has become fragile, that their inner world has become thin, scattered, and dependent on whatever happens to appear on the screen next. This emptiness is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of a mind trained to react rather than reflect. When your attention is constantly being pulled outward, your inner life begins to starve. And the more your inner life starves, the more you rely on external stimulation to fill the void, creating a cycle in which the collapse of deep thinking accelerates with every new habit of distraction. It becomes harder to read a book, harder to watch something without checking your phone, harder to be quiet, harder to stay present, harder to finish tasks, harder to form your own ideas, harder to understand yourself. But perhaps the most troubling consequence is this: when you lose the ability to think deeply, you also lose the ability to feel deeply. Emotions become reactive rather than reflective. Quick flashes of sensation, triggered by stimuli, rather than grounded, meaningful responses formed through understanding. And as both thought and emotion become shallow, the person begins to feel like a shadow of themselves, living a life filled with activity, but lacking in direction, filled with noise but lacking in insight, filled with motion but lacking in purpose. The modern environment, with its endless demands on attention, has reduced life to a sequence of reactions, and because reactions are fleeting, they never create a stable foundation for identity, meaning, or fulfillment. A person who lives in reaction is always moving but never arriving. They exist in motion but not in depth. And the tragedy is not that people are incapable of deep thinking, it is that they rarely get the opportunity to practice it. The world is not too complex for the mind. The world simply never stops long enough for the mind to engage with it. But the moment a person recognizes this, the moment they become aware of how much of their consciousness has been shaped by reaction instead of choice, is the moment they gain the possibility of reclaiming their inner world. Awareness is the first spark. The rest is a long, quiet journey toward restoring the depth that modern life has slowly eroded. There is something uncanny about the way emotions spread today, not as personal responses to the world, but as synchronized waves that move across millions of people at once, creating the strange impression that the entire population is experiencing the same feelings in the same rhythm, as if we have all begun to share a single emotional nervous system. And what makes this even more unsettling is the fact that these emotions rarely arise from our own lives, but instead from whatever the digital world has decided to amplify at that particular moment. In earlier eras, emotions were deeply connected to personal experience, the people you saw, the events you lived through, the conversations you had, the environment you moved through. But modern emotional life has detached itself from lived experience and fused itself to digital stimulation, meaning that we often feel more intensely about what appears on a screen than about what happens in our physical reality. And because the same content reaches everyone, in the same format, at the same speed, we begin to mirror each other not through shared experience, but through shared exposure, reacting not to life itself, but to the filtered, curated, emotionally charged fragments the algorithm places in front of us. It's incredibly easy now for millions of people to feel the same anger, the same envy, the same humor, the same insecurity, the same outrage, not because their lives contain identical struggles or desires, but because emotional triggers have been mass-produced and delivered in a form optimized to evoke quick, strong reactions in the widest possible audience. When emotions are shaped by repetition, they become predictable. When they become predictable, they become controllable. And in this predictability lies the quiet erosion of emotional individuality. Most people don't realize how easily their emotional landscape is influenced by the subtle design of digital content, the pacing of videos, the tone of voices, the editing rhythms, the colors, the background music, the emotionally loaded phrases designed to provoke very specific reactions. All of it works together to pull the viewer into a state where emotions arise automatically, almost involuntarily, without passing through the slow filter of reflection or the grounding of personal experience. This automation of emotion, repeated day after day, begins to change the way people feel, not just online but in their actual lives. The person who consumes a steady stream of anxiety-inducing content becomes anxious even in peaceful situations. The person who consumes a steady stream of outrage becomes irritable even when nothing is wrong. The person who consumes a steady stream of unrealistic beauty becomes insecure even when they are perfectly fine. The person who consumes exaggerated positivity becomes uncomfortable with real emotion, preferring the polished simplicity of digital happiness. Over time, emotional states become templates just like desires do, repeating themselves across millions of people who believe they are experiencing something personal but are actually participating in a synchronized emotional cycle created by algorithms engineered for engagement. This is why emotional life today feels strangely repetitive. The same kinds of sadness, the same kinds of humor, the same kinds of confidence, the same kinds of fear, all circulating endlessly in recycled forms that people absorb without questioning, until their emotional responses begin to resemble everyone else's. And, as emotional individuality dissolves, people lose the ability to understand their own feelings deeply, because emotions that are copied rather than experienced cannot teach us anything about ourselves. They only teach us how to react on cue. Real emotional depth requires slowness, the slowness to notice what you feel, to understand where it comes from, to sit with it long enough for it to reveal something meaningful. But the digital world moves too fast for that, pushing people into a constant state of emotional momentum where no feeling lasts long enough to be understood before another takes its place. This constant emotional turnover leaves people in a chronic state of low-level confusion, as if their inner world is always rearranging itself faster than they can make sense of it. And this confusion often disguises itself as emptiness, irritability, or numbness, symptoms of a mind that cannot ground itself, because its emotional life no longer belongs to it. And beneath all of this lies a deeper truth. When people start feeling the same emotions in the same way, they begin to lose the inner complexity that makes them distinct. Emotional uniformity flattens the inner world, smoothing out the unique edges that once defined a person's temperament, replacing them with predictable patterns that align more with cultural momentums than with individual experience. People become easier to read, easier to influence, easier to provoke. Not because they lack intelligence, but because emotional synchronization creates the illusion that everyone is living in the same psychological space, even when their real lives are nothing alike. This creates a paradox of modern emotional life. People feel more emotions than ever before, yet understand themselves less than ever before, because these emotions rarely originate from their own stories, but from the collective emotional theater unfolding online. And when emotions lose their personal origins, they lose their meaning. You can feel sadness without knowing why. You can feel anger without being harmed. You can feel envy without wanting what you envy. You can feel inspiration without taking action. You can feel connected without being close. You can feel overwhelmed without anything happening. These emotions float inside you without roots, like weather systems that pass through and leave you exhausted without ever telling you what they meant. Emotional uniformity is not just the loss of individuality, it is the loss of emotional intelligence. Because true emotional intelligence depends on understanding the relationship between your feelings and your life. And that relationship is severed when emotions no longer originate from your life at all. In the end, people are left with emotions that feel real but belong to no one, reactions that feel personal but are shared by millions, and an inner world that feels increasingly silent beneath the noise because the parts of the self capable of deep, emotional life have been crowded out by the constant arrival of borrowed feelings. And when borrowed feelings dominate the inner space, the authentic self doesn't disappear, it simply has nowhere left to speak. There is a quiet but powerful truth about the modern world that rarely gets acknowledged, a truth that explains why so many people suppress their complexity, soften their edges, hide their depth, and choose to present a simplified version of themselves. Society, especially in its digital form, is naturally drawn to people who are easy to categorize, easy to understand, and easy to consume, meaning that the more layered, nuanced, and contradictory a person is, the more they feel pressure to flatten themselves into a version that fits neatly into expectations others can process without effort. Human beings have always been complex, carrying conflicting beliefs, unpredictable emotions, evolving identities, but modern culture is structured in a way that treats complexity as inconvenience, rewarding those who present themselves in clear, digestible labels, while punishing those whose personalities require patience, quiet attention, or deeper engagement to fully understand. This pressure to simplify oneself begins early, often in subtle ways. You learn which parts of your personality are praised and which are ignored, which parts earn approval and which create confusion, which qualities attract people and which make them uncomfortable. And before long you start trimming away the aspects of yourself that feel too much, leaving only the pieces that fit smoothly into the environment around you. And because this environment increasingly exists online, in a space where attention spans fracture, assumptions form instantly, and strangers judge with speed unmatched in any other period of human history, people quickly learn that being nuanced, ambiguous, or contradictory invites misunderstanding, and misunderstanding invites conflict, and conflict invites isolation. so they adapt by choosing the safer path of predictability. Predictability in the digital world is rewarded with visibility. People who fit clearly into categories, the fitness person, the beauty person, the productivity person, the intellectual person, the lifestyle person, rise faster because the world knows what to expect from them. An expectation creates comfort, and comfort keeps people returning, which is precisely why the world subtly encourages the simplification of identity. This doesn't happen through explicit rules. It happens through feedback, the applause for being consistent, the silence for being different, the confusion when you express something unexpected, the discomfort others feel when you don't match the persona they constructed in their minds. And little by little, these responses shape your self-expression more powerfully than any internal decision. Over time, you begin to hide the parts of yourself that don't fit your chosen narrative. Not because they are untrue, but because they complicate the image the world has grown accustomed to. And maintaining a stable image becomes easier than revealing the full, intricate reality of who you are. The tragedy is not that people stop being complex. It is that they stop showing their complexity, storing it away in private corners of their minds where it slowly begins to feel like a burden rather than a gift. This creates an unusual emotional fatigue, the fatigue of living a reduced version of yourself, the fatigue of constantly managing how others perceive you, the fatigue of translating your depth into something the world can digest without hesitation. People become tired not because their lives are difficult, but because their identities are compressed. And compression always creates pressure, even when it is self-imposed. In this state, many begin to feel strangely hollow, as if the person others see is not the person they feel themselves to be. And this disconnect grows with each passing year, creating a quiet sadness that comes from realizing that the world only knows the outline of your personality, while the full picture remains hidden behind layers of unspoken truth. This sadness often surfaces during moments of honesty, late at night, in private conversations, in sudden introspection, when the mask slips slightly and you recognize how much of yourself you've muted for the sake of being understandable, and how much potential has been left unexplored because exploring it felt too risky in a world that prefers clarity over complexity. But the deeper issue is not emotional, it is societal. A society built on speed, efficiency, and instant interpretation naturally gravitates towards simplicity, because complexity requires time, patience, curiosity, and emotional bandwidth, all of which are increasingly rare in a culture that values quick conclusions and rapid consumption. In such a world, the simplest stories rise to the top. The straightforward success story, the clean moral narrative, the easily marketed lifestyle, the attractive but unthreatening persona, the identity that remains consistent regardless of context. But real human beings do not fit into such narrow narratives, and when they try to, something essential within them begins to dim. This dimming is not always noticeable at first. It starts as mild discomfort, a sense that you are holding back, a feeling that you are editing yourself in conversations, choosing silence where honesty would require too much explanation, smiling at things that don't resonate, avoiding topics that reveal too much of your mind, or pretending to be more certain, more consistent, or more stable than you actually feel. And eventually, without realizing it, you begin to live as if you were playing a character rather than living a life. This character might be admired, respected, praised, or supported, but they are not fully you, and the parts of you that don't fit the character begin to feel like flaws rather than facets. Yet beneath this tension lies a remarkable truth. The parts of you that feel too complicated are often the most alive, the most original, the most meaningful, because they come from a place unaffected by mass influence or expectation. They come from the deep interior, the part of you that does not bend easily to external pressure. This is why reclaiming your complexity is not merely an act of authenticity. It is an act of resistance against a world that hopes you remain simple, predictable, and easily classified. A predictable person is easy to follow. A predictable person is easy to influence. A predictable person is easy to understand. But a person who allows themselves to be fully complex refuses to be reduced, and in that refusal, they rediscover the depth and freedom that make individuality possible. There is a quiet but powerful truth about the modern world that rarely gets acknowledged, a truth that explains why so many people suppress their complexities, soften their edges, hide their depth, and choose to present a simplified version of themselves. Society, especially in its digital form, is naturally drawn to people who are easy to categorize, easy to understand, and easy to consume, meaning that the more layered, nuanced, and contradictory a person is, the more they feel pressure to flatten themselves into a version that fits neatly into expectations others can process without effort. Human beings have always been complex, carrying conflicting beliefs, unpredictable emotions, evolving identities, but modern culture is structured in a way that treats complexity as inconvenience, rewarding those who present themselves in clear, digestible labels, while punishing those whose personalities require patience, quiet attention, or deeper engagement to fully understand. This pressure to simplify oneself begins early, often in subtle ways. You learn which parts of your personality are praised and which are ignored, which parts earn approval and which create confusion, which qualities attract people and which make them uncomfortable. And before long you start trimming away the aspects of yourself that feel too much, leaving only the pieces that fit smoothly into the environment around you. And because this environment increasingly exists online, in a space where attention spans fracture, assumptions form instantly, and strangers judge with speed unmatched in any other period of human history, people quickly learn that being nuanced, ambiguous, or contradictory invites misunderstanding, and misunderstanding invites conflict, and conflict invites isolation. So they adapt by choosing the safer path of predictability. Predictability in the digital world is rewarded with visibility. People who fit clearly into categories, the fitness person, the beauty person, the productivity person, the intellectual person, the lifestyle person, rise faster because the world knows what to expect from them. An expectation creates comfort, and comfort keeps people returning, which is precisely why the world subtly encourages the simplification of identity. This doesn't happen through explicit rules. It happens through feedback, the applause for being consistent, the silence for being different, the confusion when you express something unexpected, the discomfort others feel when you don't match the persona they constructed in their minds. And little by little, these responses shape your self-expression more powerfully than any internal decision. Over time, you begin to hide the parts of yourself that don't fit your chosen narrative. Not because they are untrue, but because they complicate the image the world has grown accustomed to. And maintaining a stable image becomes easier than revealing the full, intricate reality of who you are. The tragedy is not that people stop being complex, it is that they stop showing their complexity, storing it away in private corners of their minds where it slowly begins to feel like a burden rather than a gift. This creates an unusual emotional fatigue, the fatigue of living a reduced version of yourself, the fatigue of constantly managing how others perceive you, the fatigue of translating your depth into something the world can digest without hesitation. People become tired not because their lives are difficult, but because their identities are compressed. And compression always creates pressure, even when it is self-imposed. In this state, many begin to feel strangely hollow, as if the person others see is not the person they feel themselves to be. And this disconnect grows with each passing year, creating a quiet sadness that comes from realizing that the world only knows the outline of your personality, while the full picture remains hidden behind layers of unspoken truth. This sadness often surfaces during moments of honesty, late at night in private conversations, in sudden introspection, when the mask slips slightly and you recognize how much of yourself you've muted for the sake of being understandable, and how much potential has been left unexplored because exploring it felt too risky in a world that prefers clarity over complexity. But the deeper issue is not emotional, it is societal. A society built on speed, efficiency, and instant interpretation naturally gravitates towards simplicity, because complexity requires time, patience, curiosity, and emotional bandwidth, all of which are increasingly rare in a culture that values quick conclusions and rapid consumption. In such a world, the simplest stories rise to the top. The straightforward success story, the clean moral narrative, the easily marketed lifestyle, the attractive but unthreatening persona, the identity that remains consistent regardless of context. But real human beings do not fit into such narrow narratives, and when they try to, something essential within them begins to dim. This dimming is not always noticeable at first. It starts as mild discomfort, a sense that you are holding back, a feeling that you are editing yourself in conversations, choosing silence where honesty would require too much explanation, smiling at things that don't resonate, avoiding topics that reveal too much of your mind, or pretending to be more certain, more consistent, or more stable than you actually feel. And eventually, without realizing it, you begin to live as if you were playing a character rather than living a life. This character might be admired, respected, praised, or supported, but they are not fully you, and the parts of you that don't fit the character begin to feel like flaws rather than facets. Yet beneath this tension lies a remarkable truth. The parts of you that feel too complicated are often the most alive, the most original, the most meaningful, because they come from a place unaffected by mass, influence, or expectation. They come from the deep interior, the part of you that does not bend easily to external pressure. This is why reclaiming your complexity is not merely an act of authenticity. It is an act of resistance against a world that hopes you remain simple, predictable, and easily classified. A predictable person is easy to follow. A predictable person is easy to influence. A predictable person is easy to understand. But a person who allows themselves to be fully complex refuses to be reduced, and in that refusal, they rediscover the depth and freedom that make individuality possible. There comes a point in modern life when the noise around you becomes so constant, so immersive, and so tightly woven into the fabric of your daily routine that you no longer notice it as noise at all, and instead begin to treat it as the natural soundtrack of your mind, a continuous stream of suggestions, judgments, comparisons, and expectations that slowly grows louder than your own thoughts, until the inner voice that once guided your decisions becomes faint, fragile, and eventually almost silent beneath the pressure of everything you've absorbed from the outside world. This loss does not happen dramatically. It unfolds quietly, beginning with the smallest compromises. The moment you choose what sounds acceptable instead of what feels true. The moment you sense that your own opinion is somehow weaker than the one repeated by others. The moment you trust external validation more readily than your own intuition. And each small moment of self-doubt reinforces a deeper pattern in which the world's voice gradually replaces your own. The modern environment is designed in a way that makes this replacement almost inevitable, because from the moment you wake up, the world begins speaking to you. Messages, notifications, updates, opinions, advertisements, trends, advice from strangers, judgments disguised as entertainment, comparisons disguised as inspiration, an overwhelming volume of external signals that press themselves into your consciousness, long before your inner voice has the chance to wake up and speak. The mind, overwhelmed by this constant influx, adapts, as it always does. It turns down the volume of its own quiet reflections so it can survive the intensity of the external world, and in doing so, people begin to lose the subtle sense of direction that once came from within. At first, this loss seems harmless, almost convenient, because thinking deeply takes effort while absorbing external narratives requires nothing more than presence. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, life begins to feel unsteady, as if you are moving forward without a compass, guided not by intention, but by momentum created by others. You might notice it when you try to make a decision and find that every option feels blurry. You might notice it when you search for your own opinion and discover echoes of what you've heard instead of anything original. You might notice it when you ask yourself what you truly want and encounter a strange emptiness, a silence where clarity should be. This emptiness is not a lack of desire. It is the absence of your own voice, buried under years of noise that has drowned out the delicate whisper that once explained who you were before the world taught you who to be. The most dangerous aspect of losing your inner voice is that external voices become incredibly persuasive once they are not competing with anything inside you. You begin to follow trends not because they resonate with your values, but because silence inside you leaves you without an alternative. You adopt beliefs not because they feel true, but because they are the loudest ones available. You chase goals not because they excite you, but because they are presented as the correct goals for someone like you, even if you have no idea who you are anymore. And all the while you feel a growing sense of restlessness, a quiet ache that something is missing even when everything appears fine on the surface. Because the part of you that once offered guidance now watches quietly from a distance, unable to speak over the noise. This restlessness often becomes misinterpreted as anxiety, boredom, or dissatisfaction, but its true root is far simpler and far more painful. You are living without the internal narrator that once gave your life coherence and meaning. When the inner voice fades, people often begin seeking answers in the outside world with increasing desperation, hoping that someone else, an impulse, a trend, a philosophy, a relationship, a lifestyle, a belief system will tell them what to do, who to be, and how to feel. Because it is easier to outsource selfhood than to rebuild it after years of neglect. But the answers given by the outside world, no matter how polished or convincing, always carry the same flaw: they are not yours. And because they are not yours, they cannot satisfy the deeper questions that your inner voice was meant to answer. Questions about meaning, purpose, desire, identity, and direction that no external narrative can resolve, because these questions belong to the soul, not to society. What makes the loss of inner voice particularly tragic is that most people only realize it when they try to listen to themselves and hear almost nothing. When they attempt to be honest and discover they no longer know what honesty feels like. When they search for clarity and find only static, as though their inner world has been overwritten by the collective noise of everyone else's ideas. Relearning to hear yourself becomes a slow, uncomfortable process. Not because the inner voice is gone forever, but because it has grown unfamiliar after being ignored for so long, and like any unused muscle, it returns, gradually in small whispers rather than confident declarations. It begins in quiet moments, when you resist the impulse to fill silence, when you allow discomfort to exist without escaping it, when you pause before reacting, when you sit with your feelings long enough to recognize which ones belong to you and which ones were borrowed. And as these moments accumulate, something subtle happens. Your inner voice grows louder, clearer, steadier, reminding you of who you are beneath the layers of noise, showing you desires that do not match the ones you have been chasing, revealing truths you have long suppressed, and slowly guiding you back to a life that feels less like a performance and more like a homecoming. The process is not easy and it is not fast, but it is the only path that leads you back to authenticity. Because no external voice, no matter how wise, can replace the deep-grounded knowing that arises when you finally listen to yourself again. In a world filled with noise, rediscovering your inner voice is not a luxury. It is a necessity for anyone who wants to live a life that belongs to them rather than to the world that tried so hard to speak on their behalf. There is an unusual discomfort that rises in the modern mind the moment solitude appears, a kind of subtle anxiety that whispers through the bed silence before you even know why you're feeling uneasy, as if being alone has become not a natural state of human existence, but a confrontation with something hidden, something long avoided, something that the constant noise of the world has conveniently helped you forget. And this discomfort reveals a deeper truth. People are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of meeting the version of themselves that emerges when all external influences fall quiet. In earlier times, solitude was an ordinary part of life, walking without music, thinking without distraction, sitting with boredom, feeling emotions without interruption. But today, solitude feels almost unnatural because the mind, overstimulated and externally guided, loses its sense of grounding the moment the flow of external noise is interrupted, causing the silence to feel heavier than it should, as though the quiet itself is judging you. This isn't because silence is dangerous. It is because silence removes the protective layer of distraction that shields you from the parts of yourself you ignored. When you are alone without a screen, without noise, without constant input, the thoughts you've postponed begin to surface, the questions you've avoided begin to whisper, the emotions you've suppressed begin to stretch awake, and the person you've been neglecting, the real you, begins to demand your attention. But the modern world has conditioned people to avoid this confrontation by surrounding them with a constant stream of stimulation, making it so easy to escape the self that most people don't even realize what they're rerunning from. Every time loneliness appears, the instinct is to reach for a device, scroll through other lives, compare emotions, absorb someone else's thoughts, or drown discomfort with sensory distraction. And this habit rewires the mind into believing that the inner world is something to avoid, even though it is the foundation of genuine identity. The fear of solitude is not simply a psychological issue. It is the inevitable outcome of a culture that teaches people to construct their identity from external pieces, trends, influences, aesthetics, social approval, and the more a person relies on external sources to build their sense of self, the emptier solitude becomes, because there is so little inside that was actually built by the self. This emptiness feels frightening not because it is dark or dramatic, but because it feels foreign, like walking into a room you once lived in but barely recognize, and the strangeness of this inner landscape makes people believe that solitude is the problem, even though solitude is simply revealing a truth they've avoided. The tragedy is that solitude, The very state people fear is also the state that could restore them. It is in solitude that the mind begins to heal from overstimulation, that buried emotions rise in a way that can finally be processed rather than suppressed, that untangled desires begin to reveal themselves, and that the quiet, steady voice of authenticity, so often drowned out by the noise of the world, begins to speak again. But solitude requires slowing down, and slowing down feels unnatural when the world expects constant reaction, constant productivity, constant performance, and constant connection, which is why many people never learn to be alone, not truly alone, not in the sense of sitting with their thoughts without trying to escape them, and instead fill their days with noise in order to avoid the discomfort of their own interior. This avoidance has a cost. The person becomes increasingly disconnected from their inner life, unable to identify what they feel or why they feel it, relying on external cues to guide their choices, drifting through their experiences without fully experiencing them, always reaching outward for stimulation instead of inward for clarity. And because solitude is avoided, emotional resilience weakens. Without time alone, people never learn to regulate their emotional waves, never learn to observe their fears without reacting, never learn to hold their own company with comfort, never learn the contours of their own mind. Instead, they become dependent on external distraction as a form of emotional management, using noise to silence thoughts, entertainment to silence anxieties, and constant connection to silence the fear that without others they may not know who they are. In a world saturated with stimuli, solitude becomes the mirror that reveals how much of your identity is borrowed. And because people instinctively avoid anything that challenges their constructed image, they avoid the mirror too, even though what stands behind it is the very clarity they claim to be searching for. Yet the irony is that the more you avoid solitude, the more alien your inner world becomes, and the more alien it becomes, the more uncomfortable you feel inside yourself, creating a cycle in which the fear of being alone grows stronger with every avoided moment. Solitude is not the enemy, it is the doorway. It is the environment in which the inner voice returns, in which desires untangled from external influence reappear, in which your emotional patterns become visible, in which you recognize what parts of your identity were shaped by pressure and what parts were shaped by truth. It is not a place of emptiness, it is a place of reclamation. The discomfort of solitude is simply the mind adjusting to a space it has neglected, like stepping into a quiet forest after years of city noise. At first, the silence feels loud, almost overwhelming, but slowly it becomes a comfort, a refuge, a home. And in that home, the self, the real self, not the curated one, finally has room to breathe. Solitude is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of self-awareness, not a punishment, but a recovery. Not isolation, but reconnection. Relearning solitude is the first true step toward reclaiming a life that belongs to you, not to the world that has been speaking over your thoughts for far too long. There comes a moment, usually quiet and easily overlooked, when a person begins to sense that something essential has slipped away from them. Not a memory or a skill or a relationship, but a part of themselves that once felt vivid, spontaneous, and unmistakably real. And though this realization rarely arrives dramatically, it carries a weight that is impossible to ignore. Because beneath all the noise and repetition and borrowed desires lies the faint but undeniable awareness that the life they are living no longer feels like a reflection of who they truly are. This realization is not pleasant. It doesn't feel inspiring or empowering at first. It feels like standing in a room full of mirrors and seeing the reflections of other people staring back at you, reflections built from trends, expectations, algorithms, emotional contagion, and the subtle pressure to fit into a simplified identity that never quite captured the complexity of your inner world. But within this discomfort lies the first spark of awakening, because the recognition that you have drifted away from yourself is also the recognition that a path back still exists, even if that path is slow, unglamorous, and entirely invisible to everyone except you. Reclaiming the self does not begin with dramatic reinventions or sudden declarations. It begins with something smaller and far more difficult. The willingness to pause long enough for your own mind to catch up with you, long enough for your inner voice, muted for years beneath external noise, to speak again in sentences instead of whispers. This pause often feels unnatural at first. Silence feels heavier than it should, time feels slower than it used to, and the mind, addicted to constant stimulation, searches frantically for the next distraction. But beneath this restlessness is the beginning of reconnection. The moment when you finally give yourself permission to exist without performing, without consuming, without comparing, and without measuring your worth through the reflections of others. At some point, you begin to notice the difference between the desires that energize you and the desires that drain you, between the ambitions that feel like yours and the ambitions that feel like costumes, between the emotions that belong to your lived reality and the emotions that were implanted through digital repetition. And slowly these differences become clearer, forming the early outlines of an authentic inner landscape that had not disappeared. It had simply been buried. The return to individuality is not a single decision, but 1,000 small recognitions. The realization that the aesthetic you've been chasing doesn't reflect your taste, the awareness that the lifestyle you've been mimicking doesn't match your values. The moment you notice that the things you've been striving for do not bring you closer to yourself, but further away. And the quiet clarity that arises when you stop asking what you should, want, and start asking what you actually feel drawn to when no one is watching. Rebuilding the self requires patience because it means confronting the parts of you that were neglected, the dreams you abandoned because they weren't trendy, the opinions you softened because they were too different, the hobbies you let die because they didn't fit the image, the solitude you avoided because you feared what it would reveal. And facing these parts can feel uncomfortable, not because they are wrong, but because they are honest. Honesty, in a world built on imitation, is a kind of rebellion. And the first form of honesty you must relearn is the honesty with yourself. The ability to say, "This is what I want," not because it is popular, not because it is impressive, not because it is expected, but because it feels like me. At first, this honesty may feel fragile. It might shake under pressure or retreat when challenged, but the more you practice it, the stronger it becomes, until gradually your choices begin to shift, not in dramatic displays but in subtle movements, choosing silence over noise, depth over distraction, reflection over reaction, sincerity over performance, self-respect over self. You begin to reclaim small parts of your life, and eventually those small parts accumulate into something larger. A life that feels aligned, not because it is perfect or admirable or aesthetically pleasing, but because it feels internally coherent, anchored in truth, rather than imitation. The world will not applaud this transformation. In fact, it might not notice it at all, because the journey back to individuality is invisible from the outside. A series of private decisions that do not announce themselves, a quiet refusal to chase every trend, a gentle return to old interests, a willingness to admit what you truly feel, the courage to let go of identities that no longer fit, the gradual unraveling of the narratives that shaped you but never reflected you. And in this quiet work, you begin to recognize something profound. Individuality is not about being different for the sake of difference. It is about being honest enough to stop performing and brave enough to live in alignment with what your inner world already knows. This kind of authenticity does not make life easier, it makes it real. Real life includes uncertainty, complexity, contradiction, and imperfection, all of which trend, culture, and digital influence try to erase. But in reclaiming these parts, you reclaim your humanity. Because the things that make you imperfect are the same things that make you unmistakably you. Eventually, the noise loses its power, not because the world becomes quieter, but because your inner voice becomes louder, clearer, more grounded, more trustworthy. And the more you listen to it, the less you feel compelled to live in imitation. Because the life, shaped by your own truth, no matter how ordinary it looks from the outside, always feels more meaningful than the life shaped by the expectations of everyone else. And this is the final realization. Individuality is not found in grand expressions or bold declarations. It is found in the quiet decision to live a life that feels like home when you close your eyes and ask yourself who you truly are.